What happened to you in Guam?
So one of the things people used to say in Guam, you either become a bodybuilder or a drunk. I became a drunk, unfortunately. They sent me to alcohol rehab for 3 weeks, which was funny. I'd go to that and literally I'd get out of the class and go right to the bar. But it was really hard for me to deal with the loss of those shipmates because I ended up what they called survivor's guilt from that because I felt like leaving the ship, I kind of abandoned my guys. Somehow I thought if I was still there, I could have helped prevent that from happening. When life starts hitting you with things that are bad, you start wondering, well, should I even be here? I think going through a separation and divorce was probably the lowest point of my life because I really did feel like a complete failure. He's like, well, you got some hurts, right? And I said, well, yeah. He goes, you got some hangups, right? And I said, yeah. He's like, and those are starting to lead to bad habits too, right? And I said, well, you got me there.
Hurts, bad habits, character defects. Have you ever heard that old nursery rhyme called Humpty Dumpty? It's all about this giant egg who fell off a wall and shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. All the king's horses and all the king's men couldn't put Humpty Dumpty together again. Have you ever felt broken? Have you ever felt like your life was in 1,000,000 pieces and no matter how hard you try, the pieces just won't go back into place? People say that time heals all wounds, but time hasn't healed your pain and you've been searching for a solution. Maybe you don't have an addiction in your life and perhaps you're able to function day by day. But isn't life more than just making it by? Shouldn't there be meaning and purpose? And shouldn't there be healing for all my brokenness? How does a person put the broken pieces of their life back together? Is that even possible for me to do, or do I need help? These are topics that I want to discuss with our guest today as he shares his life change story with us. I'm Eric Hutchinson, and this is the If Nothing Changes podcast. Today, our guest is zooming in all the way from Oregon, and I can't wait for you to hear how God put his life back together. So, hey, new friend, why don't you introduce yourself to our listeners?
Hi, my name is Tony Campbell. I'm a grateful believer in Jesus Christ. I came to celebrate recovery and getting recovery because of anger and failed relationships. And I stay because I'm still dealing with some of the PTSD I had from the service, and then just some of the character defects that I have over time.
Hey, Tony, welcome to the podcast. I'm really excited to talk to you and hear about your story. So, every story has a beginning. So why don't you tell us a little bit about your background? I know you live in Oregon now. Did you always live in Oregon, or tell us about where you were born and raised?
So I was born in Denver, Colorado. Grew up there with the Rockies in my backyard. We moved around a little bit while I was younger. And then finally, by the time I was like 15, settled in a little city called Broomfield, Colorado, which is just in the foothills of Boulder.
How come you moved around a lot? Was your dad in the military or something? Or
No, well, my dad was in the military, but my mom and him got a divorce when I was very little. And I had a sister who was born with a lot of defects. So housing became an issue. And then when he left, it kind of left my mom and I kind of stranded. So she had to move a lot to find good housing for us. And then she did remarry.
so now let's back up just a bit. You said you had a sister and also said your parents got divorced. So walk me through, at what age did your parents, decide to get a divorce?
I'm not sure the exact age, but I was probably around 3 or 4.
So now you only have the one sister, is that correct?
Yeah, biologically one sister. And then I have on my dad's side, he remarried, and I have 4 siblings on that side of the family that live in Indiana. So I used to go out there occasionally in the summer and see them. And he had remarried somebody who was Amish. So it was interesting to go out there and see the Amish and visit them. And I still like going back even to this day.
How did you get along with your biological sister? Was she older or younger than you?
My biological sister, she was always in an institution. got along with her fine, but she was institutionalized pretty much since birth. And then she passed when she was 4 and I was 6.
Oh, I'm
So yeah.
sorry. So what was it like then with your mom? It sounds to me like she was a single parent for a while. Was there, I mean, how was life with her and what was going on in your family there during that time?
Life was good with her. It was a little tumultuous. She did remarry. Unfortunately, the person she remarried was a severe alcoholic. So there was that in the mix, and just a lot of probably mental, verbal, and physical abuse to both my mom and myself over the years, which made it tough. Always loved him, but it was just always confusing as to why. Once some people that are addicted to alcohol, we see this all the time. They don't act like themselves. They're either 1 minute everything's great, and the next minute they're raging. So it's a scary time.
So was there any religion in your family? Did your mom believe in God? Did she take you to church? And what did you believe?
Yeah, I was raised a Christian. Even my stepdad, he used to teach Sunday school in his previous marriage that he had back in Oklahoma. So he was a believer. He just couldn't break the alcohol. So he didn't go to church much. I think a lot of it was out of shame. And my mom didn't go to church much because she was usually working either nights or 2 jobs, and Sunday was really the only down day she had. But they always made sure I got to church. A lot of times when I was a kid, back in those days, I walked to church. I think the longest I walked was probably a half mile, but I always loved to go. I loved Sunday school, loved to be there with the other kids and, stuff like that. So I kind of found it was kind of like a safe harbor for me when I was little.
Did you make a decision for Christ when you were a child, or did you just kind of, stay, just attend and didn't really make any public decisions?
Yeah, I made several over the years because back then in those days, I thought, well, I did something wrong. I better go back and make sure I'm good. So I would go up to the altar several times, but I probably made a serious commitment. I would say I was probably about the age of 11. I made a real serious, commitment to faith.
So what would you say the hardest thing you had to deal with growing up, and let's say pre-high school? It sounds to me like your father was one of those things, but was that the hardest thing you dealt with, or was there something else?
Yeah, probably my stepfather was the most difficult, to deal with at the time. My mom never really got over my sister's passing. I mean, I think I was so little that it didn't affect me nearly as much, but she never, ever, she carried that all the way. Or she died very young, but she carried that all the way. And I don't think she ever got the kind of support she needed. And my mom also, one of the things she did with me is, and I tell this in my testimony, she took me to an organization called Alateen, which was Al-Anon for teenagers, to be able to go and understand, kind of like Al-Anon was for the non-alcoholics and then Alcoholic Anonymous, the alcoholic. I went to Alateen and I was like vehemently opposed to go. I'm like, why do I need to go? He's got the problem, not me. And I go to church, I'm good. But I'm glad I did because I was actually able to meet other teenagers that were having the same influences in their households and to be able to relate.
Well, that's interesting. It sounds to me like you had some faith as a
Yep.
child. So many times kids don't from their parents, but it sounds like you were went to church, a church goer, and then you made some decisions for Christ. Let's move into high school. A lot of times, teenagers, that's they have a little freedom with their cars and they start experimenting, or maybe it's peer pressure with friends and so forth. I mean, how was it for you in high school? Did you hang around a good crowd, or did you get involved with some stuff that you shouldn't? Tell me a little bit about your high school.
Well, that was the time we moved. It was we moved to Broomfield right when I was getting ready to start high school. I did 1 year of junior and then high school. I couldn't really make a lot of friends there. The community of Broomfield was pretty tight. People had grown up together, and then so they did elementary, junior high, and high school. So it was hard to fit in when I first got there. So obviously, when it's hard to fit in, you naturally gravitate into the wrong crowd. it was in the late 70s and a lot of new age stuff was coming around. And, our youth pastor had a Pit House magazine, that we all found while we were over at his house. And so, of course, and of course, it was the patented lines like, oh, I just only read the articles. I'm like, so that kind of took me out of that because then my mom says, well, you're not going to that anymore. So out of that I went. But then I would say, like a lot of teenage boys, gas and perfume hit me pretty hard. I stopped going out I stopped going out for sports as much and started gravitating more trying to have work. And then I had a girlfriend. That changed my social status when I had a girlfriend because she was the mayor's daughter. So it was like a whole different, country club vibe and, whole different. And I really didn't feel like I fit there. So still had my friends that were probably not the best friends to have. So I would kind of bounce between these two, like, lifestyles, I guess you could say, different courses, but still maintained my faith, but I was definitely starting to slide away. So I never got really hooked on anything. I didn't do drugs. I was terrified of them. And basically it was just in my own mind. I was terrified of what my mom would think was one factor. The other factor I was terrified is what am I going to get on the street from somebody I don't know? I mean, what am I going to get? What am I really going to get? Is it just going to be marijuana or is it going to be something worse? And I didn't feel like I wanted to lose control. Now, I did drink beer. I started drinking beer in high school, went to some parties, but that's all I did. I think maybe once in a while we had like Boonesberry Farm wines, those silly wines that, kids usually could get a hold of pretty easily. Did some of that, but nothing really hard. We didn't do any hard liquor. But for the most part, I stayed away from drugs. I literally was scared to death of them.
So it sounds to me like it was more of a social thing whenever you were with your friends and that sort of thing. It
Yep.
sounds like you got into some dating relationship there. So before we move out of high school, I wanted to ask you this. Did your mother stay married to your stepfather? Or did he continue? Was he still a part of your life or not?
Probably after about a year, we moved to Broomfield. They got a divorce because him and my mom got in a really big fight, and he threw a beer can on top of her head, it emptied it, and then she picked up a can of Crisco grease, threw it at her, gashed him in the forehead with that. So he's got grease. So I come down and basically I'm ready to lower the boom on my stepdad because I was pretty big at that time. So it's like, I'm done with this. And so I went after my mom jumped on my back and basically kept me at bay. I had called the police before I ran downstairs, 911. So they were already on their way when I came down, and she begged and pleaded with me not to do anything. So I did stop, but I was really amped up. And I told my mom, I said, look, if I need to go move somewhere else while you guys figure it out, but I can't stay here anymore if he's going to be here. Just can't do it, And she finally decided that, yeah, I think you're right. And so she did file for divorce. So he was out of the house probably for my last 2 years of high school. I'd go visit him and we still maintained a relationship. He never messed with me after I got to size. He just that kind of went to now he wasn't scared of me. I just think he had a different respect for me after that incident.
So you went and visited him. So there must have been a relationship there, or you wouldn't have
Yep.
ever went to see him again. So
Yeah, I still loved him. I mean, he taught me so many things, taught me how to fish. He did, ironically teach me to love the Lord. I mean, his favorite scriptures was Psalm 23. And when he was really sauced, he'd ask me to read it to him. And he only drank beer. He didn't drink any hard liquor, but he drank a lot. He'd drink a case, on a Sunday, no problem. Yeah, it pretty much continued in high school until my mom and him got a divorce, and then after that, it was just, I pretty much had made up my mind. I didn't want to go to college. Decided to go in the Navy, join like a delayed entry program.
tell me a little bit about the Navy. Tell me how your experience was there and if you ever got deployed.
Yeah, it was good. Went to basic out of San Diego. Had a, you know, when I decided I was going to the Navy, my girlfriend broke up with me in Colorado because she wasn't on board with that, literally. So I'm like, okay. So I went ahead and went in anyway because I'd already, basically signed the papers, made a commitment. Um, Everything was fine. I got out of basic training, and that's where a lot of drinking started. I got kind of stuck between when we got done with boot camp. I was kind of on like a TAD on the base for like 13 weeks, just waiting to start school because they started them every so many weeks. They would start a class. So they were so booked up that, so I had a lot of free time on my hand, which wasn't a good thing to have. So I got through all my schooling and then went to sub school out in Groton, Connecticut. Couldn't pass the hearing. It messed up my ears. So I couldn't keep my ears cleared. So they sent me back to San Diego to go in the regular fleet. Made two Westpac deployments on my first ship. It was a Gator freighter where we basically would deploy Marines from the ship, either by lowering the back of the ship and then having Marines take off that way and then doing helo ops to land Marines. So basically, like if you think of the pictures like in D-Day and Normandy, we were the ships that were deploying the troops onto the different bases and stuff like that, or the different targets.
So why do you think that, and you said too much time on your hand, why do you think you started, so your stepfather, you said that was the number one issue you dealt with as a child and through high school, and he was an alcoholic. So what pulled you to alcohol in the service? Was it just other guys or what was going on there?
Yeah, it was mostly camaraderie. It's what everybody else was doing. It was kind of, you look back, it's kind of a Navy tradition to, you try to drink everybody else under the table, try to drink a town dry, which was never achievable. But you kind of had those thoughts in your mind to go do stuff like that. I think the other thing for me is I found out I had less inhibitions when I was drinking. Like I would be more brave to do things I normally wouldn't do, like maybe ask somebody to dance or, whatever, just do a lot of things that, which led to a lot of bad things I did in the service, which a lot of promiscuity, a lot of, just not doing the right things. And, which was very conflicting with my beliefs. And so it kept me in this, state. And I look back and I think sometimes that's why I didn't go to church, because I was embarrassed now to go. And I think that might have been some of the reasons why my dad didn't go, because he was embarrassed, of not to be able to walk through those doors or feel convicted. So, I kind of followed that same path. So, and it was interesting because I did the 4 years, and then I got out for 2 years, came back home, moved in with my mom, was going to get an apartment. She says, well, I could really use the help. So if you moved in here, you could help pay the bills. And she had remarried also at that time, which was a disaster again. But I lived with her. I worked, managed some Radio Shack stores. And it was like when I got out of the service, stopped drinking immediately. Didn't even think about it. Every once in a while, I might go out with somebody, but for the most part, I didn't drink at all. I worked really long hours at Radio Shack managing a store and just didn't have the time. And then after about 2 years of a very depressed economy in Colorado, I went back in the service. And that led me to be stationed over in Guam on a food store ship. So we would go out, kind of like a floating Walmart. We'd go out, meet the fleet, resupply them, go back into a port, same thing. And being stationed in Guam, it was like what I like to tell people was like what do you call it? A permanent Westpac. I was always on deployment basically over there. So did that for 2 years and got done with that and moved back to the States. Got stationed on the USS Missouri.
So before you move on to the USS Missouri, I want to ask you about Guam. What was the culture like in Guam? And, you mentioned kind of being embarrassed to go to church and that kind of stuff. So, when you were there for 2 years, you said, right?
Yep.
So what happened to you in Guam? Was there any, was there any issues there, or did you just making it through? Or, tell me a little bit about your experience in Guam.
Yeah, I picked up the drinking mantle when I got stationed over there. So one of the things people used to say in Guam, you either become a bodybuilder or a drunk. I became a drunk, unfortunately, and drank a lot, did a lot of other things too. I learned how to sail. I learned how to dive over there. So I did activities, but the drinking was always there. And ended up getting me in trouble. Got busted, lost a stripe. Basically, I was driving back from being out in town, and one of my shipmates decided to moon the captain, which at the time they didn't know was the captain of our ship. And of course, he was just as sauced and slouched as the rest of us were, but he was also mad and he knew who we were. So he was standing there when he parked right next to the ship. So he just stood there and waited for us. And as we were coming from the car, he's like, I want to know who mooned me. And I said, I don't know. I don't know what you're talking about. He's like, well, I know one of you did. I saw it, but I wouldn't, I knew who did it, but I wouldn't, obviously you're not going to rat your friends out. Right. So I didn't. Um, and so the next day I was called up and, went to captain's mast, lost a stripe, had to be stuck on the boat for a few days. They sent me to alcohol rehab for 3 weeks, which was funny. I'd go to that and literally I'd get out of the class and go right to the bar. So it didn't help at all. Unfortunately, I didn't take any of it serious. And I regret actually not taking it more serious at the time, but I was very stubborn and set in my ways.
So I'm curious. Whenever you were back in the States, when you got out of the military the first time, you said you stopped drinking. And
Yep.
so that doesn't sound like an addict. I mean, it didn't sound like that you got, back involved with your faith too much or whatever, but then you went to Guam and you immediately picked it back up. And it sounds like it was a little bit more serious this time as far as your usage go. At what point, or at any point, would you have classified yourself as an addict? You kind of put the quotation marks around you went to alcoholic, rehab, so, and you weren't really rehabilitated. So would you said that in Guam, looking back now, were you an addict or was it just, again, kind of a social thing?
I think it was purely social. I never really claimed that as that I had a problem with alcoholism because I felt I could stop at any time and I did. So it was like, so the same thing. I did the same thing. I was stationed there. And then when I went back to the States on the Missouri, I went out, but not near as much. I started to kind of curb a little bit of that. And then when I got out, I kind of still drank a little bit, but I was working a shift where it was a 12-hour day shift. I couldn't. I said, okay, I can't function and do this job. And I was married now. So I was like, okay, well, I can't do both of these and be married. So I gave it up again. Didn't even think about it. Now I would drink occasionally at a dinner or a party, but for the most part, just didn't even do it. And so to me, it was interesting. I was just able to set that aside.
Yeah, that doesn't sound like an addict, that you talk about addicts saying, I'm out of control. I can't stop myself, but that didn't sound like it was you. Now, again, being in recovery, we talk about codependency and that we make decisions based upon what other people want us to do. And a lot of people say, I've got a love and relationship addiction. Again, that's looking for relationships. That's their addiction. And then some people, it's just, they want to be accepted. I had one guy on my podcast that said, I wasn't drinking alcohol. I was drinking acceptance. I was drinking other people accepting me. And so was there any of that going on? Or, tell me what was going on inside of you.
Yeah, I think a lot of it was just to be one of the guys to go out and be social and stuff like that. And again, those inhibitions would go away, when I would drink like that. And even some of my friends like, this is getting ridiculous. You're always all you want to do is go get drunk. And I'm like, well, what else is there to do? We're stuck on an island, and when it was funny when we'd go out to sea, of course, there's no alcohol when you're out at sea. So it was like, when I got out there, I wasn't like, in detox or anything like that. I didn't drink. It was like, okay, so I would say my drink of choice the first time I was in was Pepsi. And when I was on the ship, and then when I was off the ship, it was beer. And then when I got in the second hitch, it was more coffee, soda, and beer. I would say I had a more of addictive nature to soda pop at the time than I had it in everything else. But
I don't know that I've ever had anybody come on here and just say that they were that heavily into alcohol and getting drunk and then just to stop cold turkey without, it didn't sound to me like you really had much help with that. You just stopped. So it doesn't sound like you were really addicted. So before we get too far beyond it, you mentioned that you got married, and that's usually a pretty big event. Did you meet your your wife whenever you were on the Missouri, or okay?
Yeah.
So how did that go? I mean, did you just out? I mean, where did you meet her, and how did that happen?
So I was doing my laundry out off base because we usually did off base. It was just easier to get laundromats, and it was out there in Long Beach. And her and three of her girlfriends were also doing laundry. So we kind of started talking, and then we said, "Hey, let's go have dinner or something." So we ended up going to like a Denny's or something. And I was still, in deep to partying. Everything was just a party back then. And then over time started getting more and more serious, about the relationship, stopped hanging out with my friends as much and started hanging out with her more. She wasn't much of a drinker. She was underage at the time too, when I first met her. So she wasn't really drinking. So it kind of started to wane at that point. And then I just made a decision to either stay in the Navy or get out, and decided that I didn't think staying married and being in the Navy was going to work. So I decided to get out. Shortly after I got out, then we got married, kind of went back and met her parents out in Arizona, which was interesting because her parents were Jewish and she was raised Jewish. So that was an interesting dynamic in and of itself.
So what's going on with your faith during this time? You're in the middle. It sounds like, I mean, when you got married, you got out of the military. So, did you ever have a rededication of your commitment to Christ, or did you just continue kind of riding the fence a little bit?
I continued to ride the fence. I still wholeheartedly believed in Christ and God, even though I was in the throngs of all the alcohol and just, living a wild lifestyle. I would say that after I got married, started thinking about things a little more serious, even went so far as I would go to temple with her family sometimes. But we would also do Christian, church as well. Like, but just the major holidays. I was very much a Christmas and Easter Christian. I wasn't going all the time, or if somebody invited me to a service, I would go, but I wasn't regular. Interesting enough, her best friend, or one of her best friends in high school, got married, and he was a pastor, and they opened up a church. So we started going. And then shortly after I had my first child, I was driving in Phoenix, and I'm thinking, I've never asked you if you'd like to have a real relationship with Jesus Christ. What do you think about that? And she's like, I've been praying that somebody would ask me. And so then my wife became born again. And that caused, a pretty big rift in the family, of course, because they weren't on board with it. But they actually came to a point where they said, well, you know what? We're glad you're going to commit something to God and raise your kids in either, Jewish or Christian. And so I did bring my kids up with, keeping, at least a good understanding and respect for both faiths as they grew up. So they knew their culture and where they came from, but they also knew that we were Christ followers. So, yeah.
That's awesome. What would you say that your biggest struggle during the military years? I thought I heard you say something about having some trauma. A lot of military guys have trauma from their deployments or from whatever, but it doesn't sound like you didn't say anything about it. So did you have any kind of trauma or any stress like that in the military or not?
Yeah, my ship, the USS, it was the White Plains. I lost some crew members on there to a shipboard fire, and it was shortly after I transferred to the Missouri. They were out at sea, and we had actually found issues in the engine room that we had kept pointing out to the Navy and said, "Hey, we believe this is a problem." And they kept saying, "Oh, we don't think it's that bad," and they kind of did patchwork. And then when it did finally rupture these gaskets, and they did a full investigation, and found fault where they had to find fault, but it just really bothered me because I always thought I should have done more. So I actually held on to that for 30 years, never dealt with it, never really talked about it much. Even, with you and I talking right now, it slips back into the recluse of my brain. So bringing it up like, oh yeah, I didn't tell Eric about that. But it was really hard for me to deal with the loss of those shipmates because So I ended up what they called survivor's guilt from that, and had a really tough time. I run into things all the time, like if there's something going wrong, fire, emergencies, even at work, I'm the first guy that tries to run in there, even though I'm not even on the so-called emergency response teams here at work. It's just what I've done, even out in houses. So I always have that in the back of my hand. I've got to do something because I feel like leaving the ship, I kind of abandoned my guys. Somehow I thought if I was still there, I could have helped prevent that from happening, which is ridiculous. And part of my healing that I got, because I wasn't really addressing this in Celebrate Recovery, but I went to a vet suicide, informational class, and the guy told me, he's like, you got to quit living in, all the bad of that. You got to start living in those. What would those guys want you to do? How would they want you to remember them? Would they want you to remember them the way they died, all this stuff, or would they want you to remember them and go do good in the world? So that's kind of what led me, out of that. And then when I was asked to be, work on the welcome home for Celebrate Recovery, I was like, that's perfect because I can give back, to that. Because I went to that suicide class to learn how to help other veterans that were into those spaces of darkness. I mean, I struggled with that myself, struggled with, am I worthy to be here, and that kind of thing. When life starts hitting you with things that are bad, you start wondering, well, should I even be here? So, I've gone to the VA and worked with different treatments for that, for the PTSD. I still actively, do things in that, but doing the welcome home, having the open share groups has really helped out. And I feel like I can give back and, listen to other brothers and, help guide them, not really fix them, but help guide them like, hey, this is what I did. You can try it if they ask me. I don't offer it unless they ask, but at least being there in those groups, it's been really good and really helpful.
Did you medicate that? I mean, unhealthily? Did you go back to that? Did you go out? Did you use alcohol at all as a medication for that? I mean, what did you do whenever you felt depressed? And did that depression, because some guys, I mean, they just want to take their lives. I mean, did it ever get that bad with you or not so much?
It did, but later in life, at the time, I just went and drank. The depression didn't hit till much later. It actually was weird because, like I said, I went to that veterans class and it just like all this stuff just went boom and landed on me. Probably stuff that, from, just talking over the years had been latent and it just hadn't really materialized until that class. And then it kind of all, came to a head.
So a lot of times we bring our baggage from our past, whether it's our childhood or, the things that we did, the decisions that we made, and maybe some of the guilt and the shame that we had, we bring that into our marriage. Did any of your previous baggage from your past come into that marriage? What was your marriage like?
I would say the negative I brought was just the turmoil that I grew up with. Try to give them the best, but I think a lot of times when you grow up in those environments, you overcompensate or you do too much. One of the things my current wife noticed that when she met my kids is you treat them like an equal. You're not treating them like you're the parent. You're treating them like they're your friend. And you got to be careful with that. And that did, because once I started the new relationship, things changed a lot. But my first wife had an affair on me, and we tried for 6 years to work on that, and it just didn't pan out. So of course, when we split, I became a single dad, trying to raise 4 kids on my own. But it was yeah, it was very difficult. I had a lot of anger. I would say that's probably the negative I brought from my childhood, even from the service. I mean, I was very construction like, so anger was just, anger got things done. If I got mad, people would react, people would get stuff done. So I brought a lot of that anger in, and not only with the kids, but with her, I brought an anger, so my part of that is I think a lot of that drove her away, which made her look for other relationships outside of the marriage.
So, we talk about PTSDs in the military, but, I'm divorced. I've been divorced, and that has its own traumatic stress. and has its own impact on us. And it sounds to me like it was, I'm sure for 6 years, that's got to be hard, not to mention the betrayal. And so you get through the 6 years, you're struggling there after, and your wife, you get divorced. Where are you spiritually at that point in your life? You said you had one adult child and I guess 3 other children that are at home. How are you,
Yep.
where's God in all of this? Are you looking to him or not so much?
Yeah, I mean, I still held to my faith. I went to church regularly, took the kids regularly to church. And that's kind of how I got in Celebrate Recovery, because I went to an organization called divorcecare.org, which was really good. So it was kind of like a recovery program for that. And I learned a lot from that one. The other part I liked is that it had a program for the kids. So I had them go with me. But it was good to go. But then my friend that I was at church that I was going with, he was my first sponsor, because he kept saying, "Hey, how about try Celebrate Recovery?" And I'm like, "What do I need Celebrate Recovery for? I'm not an addict. I don't do drugs, alcohol, nothing." He's like, "You got some hurts, right?" And I said, "Well, yeah." And he goes, "You got some hangups, right?" And I said, "Yeah." He's like, "And those are starting to lead to bad habits too, right?" And I said, "Well, you got me there." So I thought I'd give it a try. And what's interesting about the bad habit part was I was actually working, 12-hour shifts, but I was thinking on that last day of work on Saturday, I would go to the bar. There's a little place in the little town of Maricopa, Arizona, native New Yorker. And I would go in there and have buffalo wings and start having some beers. And I could see this lifestyle, this old lifestyle starting to creep in. And, I feel like George reached down, was my sponsor. I feel like he reached down and grabbed me, from going down a bad path. So I'm forever grateful for him for that.
So a lot of times we speak in recovery about reaching a low or what was the bottom. Was there a bottom for you? And I don't necessarily think you have to have a bottom to have recovery or to get into that stuff, but was there a bottom for you? Was there a point that you reached your low and that you were looking for something?
I think going through separation and divorce was probably the lowest point of my life, because I really did feel like a complete failure. I feel like I failed my kids. I feel like I failed my marriage. And I was so embarrassed, and I was so angry. The thoughts that I had, the getting back, the getting even, was just unsurmountable. And, I thank God that I never acted on even a quarter of those thoughts, because they were not good. They were very, very bad.
So, tell me, what were some of the scriptures? Maybe were there any scriptures that really impacted you? Is there anything that you cling to in the Word that really gives you encouragement and hope? Or why don't you share a little bit about that?
Well, for me, the one main scripture that's always been my guiding light, even before recovery, was Romans 3:23. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And it's like, to me, it's the great equalizer, right? So people in my opinion, they get hung up on these levels of sins, right? Like, well, this person's done this and that, they could never be forgiven. I said, well, God doesn't look at it that way. He looks at, you sinned, you need repentance, you need forgiveness. So it really doesn't matter. So once you have that forgiveness, I can stand next to the worst of the worst, and we're both equal at that point. And I thought, there's nothing better than that.
So let me ask you this question: what changed? And it sounds like that recovery was a big change in your life. What was it that changed? What perspective? It sounds like your perspective changed a little bit. Sounds like your relationship with God changed a little bit. But what would you say was the big change from before recovery and after recovery?
I would say the big change is really was to work on myself. Um, I think before recovery, I was a Christian, so I knew what to do, and I was trying to tell everybody else what to do around me. And you gotta, when you're with a spouse that there's infidelity, it's really easy to point out the blames and not look at yourself at all. And I think going through recovery, it was retrospective for me to turn back and go, let's look at what my part of this is, what I did, what could I have done differently? And, knowing all well that probably wasn't going to put the marriage back together, but it was going to put me back together.
So I love that you said I couldn't put my marriage back together, but it could put me back together. And I love that statement. I tell guys all the time, the very best thing that they can do for their marriage is to work their recovery, to work on what God needs to change in your life. And then everything else will filter out through that, So I love that. That was a really good statement that you said. So Tony, let me ask you this last question. If you could give one message, whether it's the theme of your story or, you want to get this across, if listeners don't hear anything else about your story, what's that one message you want to get across to them?
I would say, I always tell people you're either in recovery or you're in denial, because one thing we all have in common is we have a hurt, and hurts left unattended only fester. They don't get better over time. And I almost can't stand when somebody says, oh, time will heal all wounds. No, it doesn't. Time does not heal all wounds. Time will let you deal with it more, but if you don't do anything or take any actual action, that wound is only going to, it's just like if you cut yourself and you don't do anything to treat it, you let it just fester and get infected, it's not going to get worse. It's not going to get better over time. It's going to get much, much worse. And that's the same with our emotional scars and those things that go on. If you don't deal with them, they're only going to get worse. And they're going to affect every single relationship that you have. I can tell you that from personal experience. I wish I could go back and not break some of those relationships I've broken over the years. And the good news is they can be mended, and they are. I mean, I know he's passed away. My sponsor's passed away. And I know he's sitting in heaven laughing. He's like, you didn't even want to get in celebrate recovery, and look at you now. You're like, you're doing welcome home. You're a rep and all this. He'd be like laughing. And I laugh at it too, just the thought, because I no way would have ever imagined or pictured that I would be on this kind of a journey,